Bret Kugelmass, welcome to the show.
Jason Jacobs, thanks for having me on your program this time.
Come on, Bret, don't be weird. Like, this is just two normal guys having a normal discussion.
Fine, I've never done a podcast before. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, so Bret, I keep wanting to call him Bret Kugelmass. Like, I swear, I just can't. I've said your name like 500 times in the last few months as we've gotten to know each other, and I don't think I've once gotten it right. But Bret Kugelmass.
There you go, you got it right.
Yeah. So this interview is a bit like the student interviewing the master, because your Titans of Nuclear podcast was actually one of the things that inspired me on the path that I'm on, and actually on a deeper level, like your climate motivation, which led you to your Titans of Nuclear podcast, is just it's eerily similar to the path that I'm on, maybe 6 months or a year behind you.
I know when I make introductions to you to people, I send them another follow-up email being like, Jason's my spirit animal. He's the person out there that I think I relate to the most on this climate journey that I'm on. And so it's appropriately titled, your podcast name, Climate Journey.
Yeah, and I think part of that is really comforting in that I do feel like I'm not as alone. And then part of it is really scary because you're a fucking animal. And it's like, man, like, if this is who I see in myself, then like, I've got problems.
Well, I mean, I think it helps that so when I moved out here to get this started, I had a family, I moved out by myself. It was easy for me to just go, like balls to the wall, crazy, doing as many episodes as I could, nonstop, traveling the world. I mean, now it's been 2 years, we're at over 170 episodes. So it's
2 years, 170 episodes.
Yeah, it's been pretty crazy.
Huh. So I'm just thinking, I committed to 2 episodes a week, so that's 104 a year. Oh, you know what that means? That means in 2 years we're gonna have over 200, so you're weak.
All right, I gotta pick up the pace.
So take me back, Bret. So, I mean, you're full on in nuclear now, but how did you get here?
Yeah, I mean, similar to your story, after I sold off my tech company, I was looking around trying to figure out, what's the best way to spend my time, my resources, like what would feel fulfilling to work on, and the answer to that just constantly kept to mind. By some prodding from friends who remind me that this is all I talk at cocktail parties for the last 10 years.
What was all you talked about?
Climate change.
Okay.
Climate change.
And where did that come from? Was there some specific moment that was a turning point for you, this awakening, or was it gradual?
I don't know, I think everyone has something that they naturally gravitate towards. And it doesn't matter what it is, but I think the key is understanding that thing about yourself and then building the rest of your life around it in order to work on that thing that drives you. So I don't think it's so much like, how did I find climate change? It was just that like climate change was the thing, and how did I decide to build my life around it?
And how did you decide to build your life around it? So you were in between companies, you were wandering in the wilderness, if you will, you had climate change on your mind. What then?
So,
has this story, is this out there like in a bunch of places, or is this breaking news?
I don't know. We'll see how it comes out. Like, clearly, I had to take meetings with people, and I walk through my story, and even on my podcast, little bits and pieces that have probably come out. But we'll see what new gets revealed this time.
Yeah, because you did the one interview like where you flipped it around on Titans of Nuclear, but like I feel like your thing is it's more business-like than my thing. So if there's one goal I have, it's to like get some new stuff out of you over the course of this discussion.
Yeah, that's
so
fine. Yeah,
you're walking in the woods, you had climate change on your mind. Then what?
Yeah. So here's something new for you. When I went to grad school, I took a class called Design Thinking as part of my major. I got a master's in mechanical engineering, and ME 310, it's design thinking. The class is really about framing the problem correctly. Once you frame the problem correctly, you can develop whatever skill set you need, in the case of this class, if you need to learn how to solder together a circuit board, you can figure that out. But the real key is to understand, do you need to build that circuit board to begin with? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? And so, upon from reflecting the last 5 years of running a business and upon the fundamentals of the subject that I learned, design thinking, I tried to apply the same thing to climate change. And I said, okay, let's just take a step back. Let's now focus on the media narrative. Let's just try to identify what is the problem. And so everything has come from framing the problem. And so, what is climate change? To me, climate change it's going to be like untold human and environmental damage over the course of, some period of time. So the first thing that we have to do is figure out what period of time is that going to be, what kind of damage was there going to be, and what even causes climate change, right? To some people, it's actually not even so clear. A lot of people think it's emissions, right? It's CO2 emissions that you put into the air every year. No, that's not what causes climate change. What causes climate change is the CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions that have already been in the air. That's what's capturing the heat. So,
and how were you learning this stuff along the way? Were you reading books?
Interviewing people. So before there's a podcast on nuclear only, I was just meeting with climate scientists. Kerry Manuel from MIT, many of the...
Wow, I didn't even know this part. So your story is even more similar to my story than I thought.
Yeah, well, I wasn't thinking about the podcast at that point, but I was just trying to meet with climate scientists.
Yeah. So you were just meeting them to learn?
Just meeting them to learn. The two things that jumped out to me was first, that the consequences that are the most serious, at least in my mind, were going to be drought. And then some people push back. It's like, oh, okay, there's precipitation and then there's moisture in the soil, so drought just doesn't really cover. Okay, whatever. Changes to precipitation, right, that affect people's ability to produce food. That, let's call it drought from here on out, but that is what is going to cause hundreds of millions of people to either starve to death or be displaced, which then can then lead to civil conflict. That's the issue. And that's not happening in 2100 when we're going to have the sea level rise of this, that, or that many feet. No, that's going to start happening in the next few decades. It's already started happening. People attribute Syria to that. A lot of the migrant crisis, even on our southern border from Central America, they attribute to precipitation variability. And it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And so we're looking at a world in which just in a couple decades, we're going to see hundreds of millions of people displaced due to drought.
And that's what you were learning about as you were making the rounds?
Yes, and so the first problem definition that I set was that, okay, this is something that needs to be totally reversed in just a couple decades, not something that we need to slow down by 2100. So that was the first part of the problem. What is it that we're even doing here? And the other part of the problem, which is what I was saying, I cannot hammer home on this enough. It is not new emissions that cause climate change. It is the greenhouse gases in the air. Yes, new emissions change the rate at which we accumulate heat. That rate is called radiative forcing, right? But even if you were to zero out all global emissions in every single sector, whether it be industry, transportation, electricity, agriculture, heat, all of them combined, if you were to zero it out, we would still have accelerating, runaway, out of control climate change at actually not that different a rate than we have today.
Wait, so I just want to understand. So there's the ppm or parts per million that's already in the air, right?
Yes.
And what's that?
I don't know, the beep. Yours or mine?
I don't know, but we're not editing this out. This is all I take it as it comes. Woo! So you have parts per million that are already in the air, but you're saying if you zeroed out all new emissions that the parts per million would continue to climb?
The parts per million would still be in the air. The heat that's parts per million trap would continue to climb. So the temperature is going to keep rising even if you level out the ppm.
The heat will continue to rise based on the current ppm that's in the air.
The heat capture, the temperature, the average temperature year over year will continue to rise even if you zero out all new emissions.
So would that also happen if we weren't in the 400s for ppm and we were back at the levels that we were pre-industrial?
Yes, we've been heating since about 1750.
So would the planet just continue to get hotter regardless of where the ppm is?
That's right, and what the ppm does is it determines the rate at which it gets hotter. So here's a good analogy. Let's say that you're driving somewhere, but you're driving in the wrong direction.
Uh-huh.
If you're driving in the wrong direction at 1 mile per hour, not that big a deal. At some point you can figure out how to turn around and you haven't lost that much ground. Once we hit that, 400 ppm mark, we were traveling in the wrong direction at 60 miles an hour. If we don't add another ppm to the air, that means no new emissions, period. All humans disappear. All human activity disappeared tomorrow. You would still be driving the wrong direction at 60 miles an hour. Because the ppm we've already added to the air.
So what would actually, I guess there are things that could slow that, but is there anything that could ever reverse that?
Yeah. Well, what you could do, I mean, there's geoengineering stuff people talk about. I'm going to put that aside for now.
Well, that's not really reversing it, it's just masking it.
Well, that's right. It's just masking it, and it still might.
It's like anxiety medication versus meditation.
And it might even make the problem, if I've defined the problem as drought or precipitation pattern changes, it might even make the problem worse. So we're going to put aside geoengineering just for a second.
Why'd you bring it up? No, I'm just kidding.
The only other thing that we can do is get the greenhouse gases out of the air and get them somewhere else, probably back into the ground, right? Or into building materials.
So pulling carbon out, either sequestering it, converting it into valuable products, etc.
That's right. That is the only way that we can reduce the rate at which we accumulate heat other than geoengineering.
But to do that, at least from the novice reading that I've done, there'd be a big land use problem and a big economics problem in terms of it's just so prohibitively expensive, especially to do it at that scale. Who's going to pay for it?
Right. So now, okay. So your line of thinking is exactly my line of thinking. So now that is the next question. So we're solving a problem here, right? We're trying to solve climate change. So we started by correctly defining the problem, and now we're working towards solutions. And what we're doing is we're saying, how do you pull that much CO2 out of the air in a way that is economically rational, in a way that makes sense given the resource constraints of the globe?
Just to pause for a minute, but when people used to say if we were more aggressive at getting on this stuff back when we first started knowing about it decades ago, that emissions reduction would have been enough. Is what you're saying, that no matter what, emissions reduction wouldn't have been enough?
Back to my car analogy, by 1990 we were, 30 miles per hour heading in the wrong direction. So now we're 60 miles per hour heading in the wrong direction. But either way, we're going to still keep heading in the wrong direction at 30 miles an hour, even if we address this in the 90s.
Even without the Industrial Revolution?
Well, no, now the Industrial Revolution is back when we started going to 1 mile an hour, 2 miles an hour in the wrong direction. And then it's the Industrial Revolution plus 100 years of cumulative emissions that has us going at the 30, 40, 50, 60 miles per hour.
So it would have been happening anyways, but just so incredibly slow that it would have been statistically insignificant.
It might have even been better. Listen, there's nothing actually wrong with climate change. Maybe we, as advanced human species, we should be thinking about changing the climate to best suit humans and the environment. The question is the rate of change, right? So if we change things so fast that the 7 billion people living on this planet cannot adapt in terms of their food infrastructure, in terms of the way they live, in terms of the cultural effects that it's going to have when you move people from one area to another that they don't own, that they don't belong, that's what's going to cause total and utter chaos and devastation.
Okay, got it. So the global warming is caused by the CO2 that's already been emitted. Let's keep going.
Right.
So you're on your journey. You piece that together.
Put that together, and then I said, okay, what's next? So now it's about what causes this problem to begin with, and what is it going to take to reverse this problem. You can either pull all the CO2 out of the air using some sort of machines, right? Or you could do it biologically, perhaps, right? So those are essentially the two paths to getting the CO2 out of the air. The problem with doing it from like a machine-based perspective, giant fans that suck the CO2 out of the air, sort it, rip apart the C's, rip apart the carbon and the oxygen, and do something with those. So that takes energy, and what's causing all of this is energy. So if you're going to do it the machine route, you need an energy source that's carbon-free, scalable to global levels of consumption, cheap, right? Because you still have to give energy to all the people on planet Earth.
So is reducing emissions still important?
I would argue that current emissions, well, let's look at it this way. Current emissions are what? Net 20 gigatons of CO2 per air. What's already in the air is 1,000 gigatons of CO2. So it's about 2% of the problem. So are they important? If you can solve the 1,000 gigatons that's already in the air, I would say no. you do not have to worry about reducing new emissions. You don't have to worry about the 20 gigatons that we add every year if you have a solution to remove the 1,000 gigatons of CO2. Now, a lot of people don't like to hear that, by the way. That is extremely controversial. People think that alienates people. It feels that they can't do anything. It alienates entire industries that are the advocates of dealing with climate change.
And it gives people permission to keep doing whatever it is that they're doing.
But there might not be anything wrong about that. If you produce let's say 20 tons of garbage a year, right? Oh, garbage is a bad thing. But if we have a mechanism in society to collect all that garbage and turn it into valuable products, including landfill that builds up the Boston Harbor, right? That was all built with landfill, right? Is it a bad thing that you created 20 tons of garbage a year? No, you helped build Boston. So it is very emotional that we associate waste with bad things, but it's not necessarily true. It matters how you manage that waste. It matters how you deal with that.
Okay, so just...
And there's nothing, other than climate change, there's nothing wrong with putting CO2 in the air.
Wait, so I just want to recap. So your first aha on this journey was that the existing carbon in the air is the majority of the problem, and the new emissions are on top of that, but a small percentage of the overall problem. And the second aha was that given that, cracking carbon removal at scale is the most important thing to solve. Is that right?
I would say that that's the second and third aha. The first aha was how fast we need to do this, that this needs to be done within 20 or 30 years. This is not something that can wait until the second half of the century because of the devastation that it is going to cause to people.
Yeah, but this being getting the carbon in the air under control, right?
If we have a solution to deal with the carbon in the air, we do not need to worry about new emissions.
Okay, so we got to get the carbon in the air under control. New emissions are small percentage-wise relative to the carbon in the air that already exists if you look at like numerators and denominators, and therefore finding a solution to getting carbon out of the air at massive scale is the thing that if cracked would be far more impactful than anything else that we could do.
It's the only thing that matters. If you ask yourself the question, and I like to ask, okay, people probably pitch you startup ideas, right?
Sometimes.
Okay, so people.
I try to avoid it now if it's not climate focused.
Right. So people pitch me people pitch me ideas all the time too. And one of my first gut checks on them is, what does the world look like if you got everything that you're asking for right now? If I gave you a couple $1 million, if you built out that product, does that actually get you what you think you want? You have to define what you want. And the answer with respect to climate change is, if you were to get rid of all emissions globally, worldwide, across every single sector, would that get you what you want? Nobody's thinking like that, but no, it wouldn't. You would still have runaway, out of control climate change that practically has the same effect.
Yeah, that is a different viewpoint than many experts.
Yeah, because many experts they come from a position where that answer doesn't suit their current day-to-day work. That answer means they should probably be fired or quit what they're doing. And most people rationalize around that.
Well, this is good. We have a very contrasting viewpoint that we're starting down the path of on the pod, and there's that beep again. And by putting it out there, we're going to get feedback and pressure test it. So I like it. Keep going.
Yeah. Okay, so there's two ways to get global levels of carbon out of the air, 1,000 gigatons of CO2 out of the air. You could do it biologically, or you could do it with giant energy-consuming machines. Biologically,
this is like beat. Is it BECCS? BECCS?
I don't know the acronyms. I just steer away from all acronyms on podcasts because the audience doesn't know what they are anymore.
Okay, keep going. I just want to show off that I knew the acronym.
Yeah, so it's like maybe we could genetically engineer some tree to grow 100 times as fast, or genetically engineer lily pads to cover the oceans and then specifically design them to sink after they've absorbed a ton of carbon and drop to the bottom of the ocean. Maybe, but there's nothing that I've seen in genetic engineering that is that advanced yet, and if it takes decades and decades to come along, that's too late. But when it comes to the mechanical version of sucking carbon out of the air, now all you have to do to figure out if this is possible is look at non-carbon based energy systems. And so this is what I did in October of 2017. I ran my own analysis of all of the various energy systems out there, and I didn't have any horse in the race. I guess I worked at a solar company early on in my career. I don't know, maybe those are the GoPros. We can edit that out, right? The beeping.
Yeah.
I worked at a solar company early on in my career, but that was a long time ago. So I just ran my own analysis of all the various energy sources, and sure enough, nuclear energy, which I had my own preconceived notions about, it was orders of magnitude better than any other energy source. Orders of magnitude.
At doing what?
At being able to provide energy with its lowest inherent carbon footprint itself, because every energy source has a carbon footprint, right? And if you're creating carbon at a rate faster than you're able to use that energy to suck it out of the air, then it doesn't work. And that is the case with all intermittent energy sources, aka renewables. But nuclear has such a low carbon footprint and produces so much energy for that carbon footprint that you could use that energy to both account for its own carbon footprint and remove the 1,000 gigatons of CO2 from the air. And it's the only energy source that the math works out like that.
Yeah, because I've heard you say carbon negative energy when you talk about nuclear. I never understood what you meant.
Yeah, so carbon negative energy. So, well, let me add another piece of spice to the recipe. The only way that I think that this can economically work out, because people in governments are making rational choices to pollute, because energy is what gives us prosperity. Using energy, we have brought billions of people out of poverty. We have created trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars of wealth, of prosperity, of buildings, of medicine. I mean, all of modern society is based on energy. And so one could actually argue that climate change is worth the prosperity that cheap energy brings. Okay, so keep that in the back of your head also.
Well, weighing against what you were talking about, the displacement of tens or hundreds of millions of people, famine.
Yeah, right, and so even weighing against
disease,
that, energy brings
species extinction,
energy,
pollution.
Yeah, and that's what's crazy. And that's why governments rationally decide to secure the cheapest energy for their people above all else, including in India, where they're smogging millions of their own people to death. They're rationally making their decision to bring 1 billion people out of poverty and choke to death 2 million of their own people.
Okay, so how many interviews were you in out of the 170 when you started? Like, where are we in that story?
We're still before zero. So now I've just run the numbers and decided that nuclear energy was the only way that we could pull 1,000 gigatons of CO2 out of the air.
Got it. So you were in discussions, but not in interviews yet.
Yes.
Okay.
But, I mean, this is me just doing some math, reading some books, obviously that there's more to the story, as you always find when you talk to people. And so then I went out to discover what that more to the story was. I moved to DC, I set up the Energy Impact Center, essentially to understand nuclear energy better.
Wait, let me ask you a question I know the answer to, but our listeners don't, that I think is relevant. How did you pick DC?
Okay, this is an interesting one. So I, as part of trying to map out what nuclear energy even was, I went online, I put together a list of, I just Googled nuclear energy conferences. I found every nuclear energy conference in the last 20 years. I then created a spreadsheet with every company of anyone who had ever shown up to one of those conferences. I then built a little mapping interface. My last business was mapping with drones, so that was fun and easy for me to do. I built a little mapping interface, and then I plotted those, I think it's 1,500 companies that had shown up to nuclear conferences in the last 20 years, and the concentration was mostly on the East Coast, and I figured, and then a lot of those conferences happen to show up in DC too. So I figured I would have access to the most people in the most efficient manner if I set up in DC.
And you just came here all by your lonesome?
Came here by myself, didn't know anybody.
When was that?
2017.
Okay.
It's the end of 2017.
And to do what in your mind at that time? What were you coming here to do?
My goal was to So while I was making this process, I also broke out all of these people into categories. Are they technologists? Are they economists?
Nuclear people.
Nuclear people.
Yeah.
Technology economists, are they part of the industrial supply chain? So now I had this just like incredible list of people and expertise. And so my goal was to talk to every single category of expertise and talk to at least 10 people in each.
Now, when you discovered that we needed a carbon negative energy source, and you discovered that nuclear could be that energy source, and that got you really excited, there's a lot of well-known criticism of nuclear out there on the safety side, on the proliferation side, on the waste side, on the cost side, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Were you well versed on those concerns at that time, or did you then dig into pressure tests that nuclear had the whole package and not just the zero carbon energy? Like, were the unintended consequences of these other things, were those on your mind at that time?
I went in assuming those were all problems that could be solved with some elegant engineering solution. As a good mechanical engineer, I was like, yeah, I had my preconceived notions about waste, radiation, safety. I was like, okay, fine.
Uninformed yet, but your hypothesis was that if you did the work, you would find that it was solvable?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, and that was back in 2017?
That was it was back in 2017 that I started this, and then throughout, it took me like 3 months to even get my first 5 people to talk to me in the nuclear energy space. It's a very like secretive, closed-off group. They feel like they've been constantly attacked for decades, and it took a long time for me to gain the trust of the community.
You're such a likable guy.
It's just a face.
Okay, so you could be zero carbon energy, had these concerns, were confident that there were answers if you went and did the work, moved to DC to start the process of doing that work. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's right.
Okay, and then what?
And then within the first few months, all of these preconceived notions, the waste, the safety, the radiation, the weapons, one by one, I found that these were myths. And all of these preconceived notions were dispelled. The waste has never hurt a single person, place, or thing in all of human history. How is it possible that something is so dangerous that it needs to be protected for millions of years if it's never hurt anyone ever? And then when I started interviewing experts on waste, I was like, well, can you paint the picture of how someone could be hurt by waste to me? And their answers were ridiculous. Most of the answers were, well, if we forgot about it 1,000 years from now, whatever case it was in might be eroded, little flecks of dust might come off, someone might be walking by in this advanced civilization that just forgot about the waste, a fleck of it might get into their lungs, and they would have like a 0.02% increased chance of getting cancer. And I'm like, that's the best you can do for waste? Are you kidding me?
But isn't this stuff just sitting in temporary caskets right now at these facilities?
So what? So what hazard does it pose is the question, right? This table does pose a hazard, right? You could trip, you could fall, you could hit your head on it, and people do. People die due to tables.
Is that a threat?
You better watch what you say, maybe it will be. So people, everything imposes a risk. It turns out that nuclear poses less of a risk than this table right here because there's so much less of it. It is 3 million times the energy density of coal. What that means is for the same heat produced, there's 3 million times less stuff that comes out the other end. There's so little of it.
So for the people that would then respond and say, well, what about Yucca Mountain?
Right.
What do you say?
What about Yucca Mountain?
Yeah, well, we tried to find a long-term home and we couldn't get it happen politically, and we have all this stuff sitting in caskets and there's nothing we can do with it. It's got to find a home, and we're just going to dig a hole and hope it never comes up, and it's super toxic and terrible.
It's based on a faulty thesis. I'm noticing the clothes that you're wearing here. You got some red socks. You got some nice jeans. Was that raw denim? You got a nice shirt on. So all of these things were made with dyes that meant gallons and gallons, just for the clothes you're wearing now, of toxic chemicals, which last infinity long. Okay, not millions of years, infinity long, were just dumped into the environment at rates 1,000,000-fold what nuclear would do, right? So not only is it not hazardous on its own, but everything else that we dismiss as, we'll just throw it in a landfill, right? What if I were to ask you, like, what do we do about the clothes waste, right? And I were to say, well, you cannot wear any clothes. Society cannot have clothes until we figure out how to deal with the toxic waste that lasts infinity long from every person's clothes on this planet. You would look at me like I'm ridiculous.
I would. My kids would say, yeah, we get to be nudies.
but
I would think it's ridiculous.
So after I learned about how little a hazard nuclear waste created, that's how I felt. I felt that anyone who asked that question, it was a ridiculous question. And now I know it still needs to be dealt with. Listen, if we're going to deal with this thing on a society-wide basis, we need to have better answers. We need to find better ways to communicate with people about these issues that people have a very emotional response to. I acknowledge that. But here, you and me, and to your audience listening, that's what I learned about nuclear waste and how dangerous it was.
Well, but what about weaponizing it? Because if it gets into the wrong hands, and how are we going to police that?
Okay, so weapons comes next. Let's talk about weapons. So, ironically, the one thing that can prevent something from becoming a nuclear bomb is the fuel staying in the reactor, right? Because what happens is your plutonium-239 bomb is a U-238 atom, uranium-238, with an extra neutron on it, right? When they make plutonium weapons, they've got to build special reactors that can add on that extra neutron. Here's the crazy thing, though. The normal commercial nuclear reactor, it is designed in a way so it captures another neutron and creates a plutonium-240. You can't make a bomb with plutonium-240. And you can't separate plutonium-240 from plutonium-239. So the one thing that makes it so it is impossible to create a plutonium bomb is a nuclear reactor. But that's kind of really in there in the weeds. Like, we're talking about neutrons now, we're talking about like different reactor types, we're talking about how things are configured, probably leads to 100 more questions, and I asked 100 more questions. But that was the next myth that was dispelled for me, that nuclear reactors could be made to use nuclear weapons.
But if you, I mean, I'm no expert, but if you ask experts in this area, they would say, well, sure, there's proliferation risk, but, and then they would give you some, well, if it's regulated properly and the pros outweigh the risk and things like that, but they acknowledge that there's some risk, but you're saying that it's impossible. So who, like, I guess where's the disconnect here?
I don't know who are you talking to? Who are you telling me? Who is saying that there's a risk? Why don't you check their credentials? Why don't you see what industry that they're in? Are they in the industry that creates nuclear power plants? Or are they in the industry that they get paid to protect people from nuclear weapons? Like, who are you talking to? I mean, you're telling me that there are people out there who are telling you that there is a risk from nuclear reactors. I'd say check their credentials. Because I did, right? So how far am I into this journey? I don't come from the nuclear industry. I'm not here to defend the nuclear industry. I'm here to learn from every nuclear expert that I can get my hands on. We've done 170 podcast episodes, but we've talked to 1,200 people in the last 2 years. 1,200. So yeah, I've been questioning people's credentials.
It's okay. So we talked about waste. We talked about
Proliferation. Yeah.
Yeah. So what about safety, catastrophic meltdowns, things like that?
Okay.
Like, not in my backyard, and specifically, and I don't know if it's case by case or what, but you hear about 3 Mile Island, you hear about Chernobyl, you talk to people who maybe grew up near the nuclear plant in Los Angeles, right? And so I haven't done all the work to like dig into all these different things, but the people that feel this way feel strongly, which would give me pause in terms of getting behind something like this until I went and did all that work.
Yeah.
So I guess you came in fresh, but you're a year further than I am, so what ground did you cover that, and where did you come out on this stuff?
Okay, so now you want to know about safety. But you touched upon a couple things there. You're like, what about those people? I'm like, what about those people? Like, do I, when it comes to solving climate change, do I really care what some elite people in Massachusetts or California think, what emotional tie they have because their parents grew up in an era where the environmentalists were all anti-nuclear, or maybe they grew up in that era where that's what it meant to be environmentalist, to be anti-nuclear?
So that's why it's based on misinformation and outdated or irrational fears, or have things changed, and if so, what?
It is based on misinformation and totally rational fears.
Uh-huh.
Totally rational fears. Why do we feel this way? Why would anyone feel so innately that nuclear power plants are so dangerous? It's because we go to these incredible lengths to add extra safety systems in order to bolster them. We put a 4-foot thick concrete dome to protect it from an airplane crash. I mean, that tells me as just like a natural citizen who should be afraid of something, means that if an airplane crashed into that, it would hurt more people than if an airplane crashed into a skyscraper. Otherwise, we would put 4-foot thick concrete domes around every skyscraper, right? So rationally, people decide that they should be afraid of what is inside of a nuclear power plant. But what do we know? What do we know from the facts? We know at Fukushima, right, where we had the 3 light water reactor meltdowns, right? We'll put Chernobyl aside for a second because that wasn't a commercial reactor, that was a nuclear weapons production facility. But the power plants that we have all across America were the Fukushima style reactors, a light water reactor. What happened when 3 of them melted down? How many people got hurt? 0. I mean, do you need to know anything more than that to make a decision to counter what you rationally feel? It's hard to counter what you rationally feel, but do you need to know anything more than that? That 3 total catastrophic, as the word you used, meltdowns of a light water reactor didn't end up hurting a single person? What more do you need to the answer to the safety question?
Yeah, well, I think the good thing is by putting this story out there, when people hear this, then I think I'll hear some of the counter arguments and other side of the story. I'm not suggesting that anything you're saying is misinformation, but you've gone and done the work. Like, one of the reasons I have this podcast is because I haven't done the work. I'm in the process of doing my work, but the podcast is a way to not only do the work, but show the work so that the listeners don't just hear the conclusion where I come out the other side, which is what I'm getting from you now, which makes sense because I'm asking you, like, what do you think? And you're telling me what you think. But 1,200 discussions went into informing what you think, right? So I'm trying to show my work.
And by the way, I didn't start speaking with this conviction until I was at conversation 865. Literally, I took some time to reflect, and I shut down the podcast for 2 months after doing it for a year. This was October of 2018, right? And so I took it down. I took it down for 2 months. Didn't record any new episodes and just spent time reflecting. Because I wouldn't say these things out loud, even after 865 conversations, a year of trying to brush up on this, because it was just so counter to the narrative that's out there. I felt embarrassed saying it out loud. It's only until this point that I reflected on it, until I started understanding why it is the way it is, why the industry speaks in a certain way, why people feel a certain way. I used to say it was irrational that people felt that way. And until I realized it was rational that people were afraid of nuclear, I didn't start dismissing these concerns around proliferation, waste, and safety.
Well, let me try a couple more on for size. So another one is, nuclear is never going to be cost competitive, and by the time it is, we're not going to need it anyways because renewables are going to carry the day.
So that's the problem to solve. So that is the problem to solve. Cost was the one issue. I mean, I came up with a list. So we talked about safety, proliferation, waste. There's a half dozen other public perception. I mean, you could categorize all.
I got one more after this, but cover this one. But then I
the only one that was left was cost.
Mm-hmm.
Nuclear.
I got one other one, but let's talk about cost.
Yeah, a new nuclear plant costs about 10 times as much. Let's say gigawatt scale plant to build as a coal plant. And your cost on a levelized cost of electricity basis is about twice as much as coal at the end of the day. How is that possible? And so that is essentially what the remainder of our conversations have been trying to figure out. It's been trying to meet with experts from all of these different perspectives to answer now that one question. What is it that is driving cost in nuclear energy?
And what's your sense of that from the discussion so far?
We could do a 10-hour podcast on that. I've started giving lectures on it. So I've now been invited out to a half dozen universities around the country and around the world to speak at conferences, on climate conferences, at nuclear conferences, because...
That was a little humble brag. You just slipped that in there.
Well,
I'm just joking.
So what I want
That's like my thing. I call people out.
Oh, good. Please do. I know. I've been listening to your previous podcast. I love it. But what I've been trying to do is answer that question as thoroughly as possible. And so I put up this lecture series online, and so people can listen to the very, very in-depth analysis of what is driving cost in nuclear energy. If this conversation isn't enough.
Where can people find that?
If you go to YouTube and you type in, oh boy, this is gonna be tough, Bret Kugelmass
Not Turtle
lectures.
saying, not, yeah.
Or you type in Titans of
Kugelman.
Nuclear, you can
Yeah.
find our channel, Titans of Nuclear. Or you type in my name, BRET, that's just one T, KUGELMASS. And type in lecture, and you'll see my lecture series.
Okay, so you've been out lecturing, and what have you been saying?
So we walk through many of the drivers of cost in nuclear energy. A lot, I hate to try to just simplify it in 5 or 10 minutes right here, but if I can narrow it down to a couple things just to give you a bit of an appetite. Outdated radiation standards and poor construction management. Those have been the two things that are making nuclear energy cost 10 times as much as it should cost.
And that, I guess on the outdated radiation management, how do we get out of that given that that's all regulated heavily by the NRC?
Yeah, not by the NRC. So the NRC is actually out there trying to do a good job. They're mandated by Congress to protect the public. They are following the radiation standards set to them by the radiation standards bodies, the ones who set this, and they are using bad data because the radiation standards bodies are misreporting what the dangers of radiation are by a factor of 10,000. 10,000. They're off by a factor of 10,000.
Why is that?
Historically, very early on, when we didn't even know about, when did Watson and Crick do their thing? I don't know. 70 years ago or something, who knows? We've only known about DNA for some period of time. We've only known about DNA for about the same amount of time as we've been able to use nuclear energy productively. And pretty early on, when there was a lot of misconceptions about how cancer was formed and what happens to the genes under radiation, some of the popular radiation people at the time, some of the popular geneticists at the time said, hey, this is a real problem. And they drew this linear comparison, a graph that showed the effects of radiation to human health, and they drew it as a line linearly all the way down to zero, and said no matter how little radiation you get, it's going to have an increased effect on you having cancer. That has since been disproven by every medical radiation study that's ever been conducted, but using that standard, this linear no threshold model has persisted, and since how radiation affects biology is extremely complex, because biology is extremely complex, they have never updated that model because there's so much infighting amongst the medical radiation standard setting community that they can't come to agreement on any other model to follow. So they just stick with the bad one that they started with 50 years ago. And that's permeated into other industries. Think of how much it costs to undergo certain types of radiation treatment. That's okay. So can we just talk about radiation for a second?
Sure.
Radiation has only ever killed or caused cancer to few people, and it has saved almost 1 billion lives through medical radiation imaging. Radiation was used to kill off skin cancers in the 1930s or 1940s, or something extremely early on. Radiation has been saving lives, and yet radiation treatment in medicine and also energy, right? So this is where I'm coming to, is far more expensive than it should be, because of these overbearing radiation standards that were set by these medical bodies.
And then what about on that last point, the construction costs? Where does that come from? And
Oh
how
my
do we
God.
get out of it?
Well, listen, this has just been one freaking disaster after another. If you look through the history of nuclear power plants being built, you can even pinpoint individuals who just made terrible construction management decisions throughout history. And then the industry as a whole has just not made great decisions either. And part of it is because the incentives were in the right place.
Are you talking about domestically or everywhere?
That is a hard question to answer. There are some examples of when it is done very well, both domestically and other places as well. But there have been examples where it's been done terribly virtually everywhere also.
And so is the answer just to work with more competent EPCs, or?
Well, part of the problem is the incentives aren't in place for the EPCs to deliver the cheapest product. The way our system is set, I mean, look, the Bay Bridge that connects San Francisco and Oakland, how much over budget and over schedule is that? We're talking like billions of dollars. It's almost all major, and the highway, the California high-speed rail, how much over budget was that? It's because the incentives are not in place for these EPCs to drive down cost. The incentives, the way that the contracts are set up, are for them to drive up costs through what are called change orders as much as possible. That's how they increase their top line.
And so how do we get out of that?
Well, I think if you find, I think you can do it contractually. I think you can set up contracts where all the incentives are in the right place, and then if you have extremely motivated and competent construction managers in place, I think you can work through these issues. But unfortunately, listen, this isn't the answer that people want to hear. Everyone wants to hear you have to have a new reactor, it's got to be molten salt, or it's got to be fusion, or it's got to be something new, right? Everyone wants to hear a sexy new moonshot thing that's going to save us, and I'm going around and I'm saying you just need more competent project management.
I'm glad that I met you when you're no holdback Bret. I feel like no holdback Bret is funner than holdback Bret. So that's just a general statement.
Okay.
But keep going.
Let's go out for a few beers after this and really see the holdback Bret.
I'm scared. Yeah. But my last question though is, or the last objection, then I have another topic to dig into, but the last objection that we didn't cover is the politically palatable one, like, hey, look, I agree with you, nuclear should proliferate, but it's never going to happen, it's not in the cards, like, the public has spoken.
When was the last time that you voted on a wastewater treatment plant in your jurisdiction?
I can't remember.
I'm sorry, in America, do we have a referendum process on infrastructure? Was that what you were implying? When does the public have a vote about infrastructure? Sometimes some states do this, but most things get built. We don't go to the public and seek for permission prior. Whatever is cheapest, right, usually gets built. Or whatever is the most powerful lobbying organization can carve out rules to create some sort of competitive advantage. That's what gets built. This idea that the public votes on nuclear is ridiculous. Yes, in some cases, in some geographies, the public has created a lot of trouble. Environmental groups have created a lot of trouble and have delayed construction, which drove up costs, which put plants economically into the unfeasible range. But there is never a let's vote and just stop construction on this thing. And then there's so many places in America that love nuclear. Just because the rich elite in California and Massachusetts don't have a fuzzy feeling about nuclear, you don't know the rest of the country. And you don't know the rest of the world.
And actually, one more I thought of, which is, can nuclear ever be cost competitive without a price on carbon?
It should be, if proper construction management were applied and the radiation standards were reset. I'm arguing that on its own, inherently, without a cost, without a price on carbon, nuclear would be so cheap that building a new one, you would be able to compete with just the marginal cost of running fossil infrastructure. I don't think you need a tax on carbon. You just need to build cheap nuclear.
Okay, so Mr. Podcaster, you've done, what did you say? You
170 episodes, 1,200 conversations.
Yeah, 170 episodes and 1,200 conversations. Here are your key takeaways. What do you do with all that information? Now you've got it. Now you know. So what are you doing?
So we're trying to enter, so I started this organization, the Energy Impact Center, essentially as a research institute to figure this stuff out, and now we're entering kind of phase 2 of our operations where we are trying to do something about it. One of the things that we're doing is we're hosting prize competitions, right, where we encourage people to design nuclear reactors based on better construction management principles. Not sexy, but that's why we need to create a prize to make it sexy. So this is one of a few initiatives that we're doing. We're also still furthering our research on drought modeling and how that affects population movement. And so we're continuing to grow and continuing to build all of these efforts to put all the pieces in place where people feel the urgency and move towards nuclear and move towards nuclear that's cheap.
Mm-hmm. And so if you look forward 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, even 50 years, and you're looking in the mirror, looking back on your life, what piece of this puzzle do you hope is the one that you made your mark on?
So now you're asking the question I always like to end my podcast on, wondering how much time are we at? Oh, that means we're coming up on an hour. Boy, you've learned from me, huh? Yeah, so what I want to do is I want to usher in an entire new era in nuclear innovation, right? That's what our organization is aiming towards right now. We are trying to make it so there can be hundreds of new nuclear companies out there that are acting in a way to reduce costs in nuclear. Not to make it safer, not to have a new type of reactor core, just to reduce costs. That is the ecosystem that we are trying to develop. And so if those 100 new companies come around in the next 5 years, and I'm partially responsible for that, I feel like I'll have done my piece to save the planet from climate change.
So just taking what's there and making it economical.
That's right.
And for the listeners out there, I guess there's two vectors I want to ask some closing questions on their behalf. One is you've put out some bold and controversial viewpoints. For the listeners that say, well, gosh, if that were true, that would completely change my thinking, but I haven't done that work. Is there a more efficient way for them to get up to speed than doing 1,200 discussions and 170 episodes? And if so, where would you point them?
Listen, unlike a lot of the other people who advocate for changes or advocate for work towards climate change, I don't think the average person needs to do anything. I don't think we need taxes. I don't think we need subsidies. I think that what we need to do is create an industry that creates cheap nuclear. And so if your listeners aren't entrepreneurs or aren't engineers or aren't financiers, I don't care what they think. But if they are, that's the community I'm speaking to. And the first thing that you can do to start getting up to speed is listen to the 170 episodes where I go into depth on every single aspect of nuclear energy.
But if they're concerned about climate change and our carbon problem, if you're them, it's nuclear all the way?
If you're not going to do it biologically, there is no other way, according to the laws of physics, that you can remove 1,000 gigatons of CO2 from the air, except nuclear energy.
And the last question, which I ask every guest, is just now put aside people and skill sets and just look at money. If you had a big pot of money, let's say $100 billion, you could allocate it towards anything to move the needle in the most impactful way to help with our climate change problem, where would it go?
I said keep your money. Change the radiation standards.
I like it. This is like, I don't know where I come out on all that, but that's some serious food for thought. That's very different than any guest we've had before.
Awesome.
Yeah. Anything I didn't ask, or any parting words for our listeners?
No, this has been fun. I've definitely enjoyed the relationship I built with you over this time, and I love listening to your podcast, and I can't wait to see what you do next.
Well, thanks, you too, Bret. So, Bret Kugelmass, thank you for coming on the show.
See you later.